Yo, what's up? I need to tell you about what went down yesterday on SportsCenter because it was genuinely one of the most explosive and emotionally charged discussions about the Golden State Warriors roster crisis and the seismic possibility of Giannis Antetokounmpo potentially joining this franchise that I've witnessed all season long. And I'm not exaggerating when I say that Scott Van Pelt, Stephen A. Smith, Tim Legler, and the entire panel spent nearly 4 hours dissecting the Jonathan Kuminga benching saga that finally reached its breaking point with a DNP in Chicago, while simultaneously exploring this absolutely mind-blowing scenario where the Warriors could pursue Giannis Antetokounmpo from the Milwaukee Bucks to form a devastating partnership with Stephen Curry that would create one of the most lethal duos in NBA history. And the way they methodologically analyzed everything from Kuminga's lack of touch and ISO scoring ability to Quinton Post's defensive excellence and distance management to Brandon Podziemski's response to rotation pressure to Jimmy Butler's health and fourth-quarter takeover to the strategic implications of trading for Giannis Antetokounmpo to maximize the remaining championship window with Curry and Draymond Green had everyone in the studio absolutely mesmerized. Because this isn't just about one disappointing young player not panning out or making minor roster adjustments. This is about the Warriors potentially acknowledging that their developmental experiment has failed and pivoting dramatically toward win-now mode by pursuing a generational superstar who could deliver their fifth championship before this core ages out completely. Hey, what's up, everyone? 1 second before we dive in. That like button right there? Hit it now. Takes literally 1 second, but makes a massive difference in growing this channel and reaching more fans. Just smash that like real quick. Every like pushes this video further, so do me that favor right now. So SportsCenter opens, and Scott Van Pelt has this exhausted but vindicated energy like he's finally about to close the book on a tiresome saga that's divided the Warriors fan base for months. And SVP immediately addresses the Jonathan Kuminga situation by explaining that Kuminga received a DNP coach's decision in Chicago, which has essentially confirmed what many people around the league have suspected for weeks, which is that his time with Golden State is effectively over. And Van Pelt admits that through at least the first half of the Bulls game, he thought the Warriors were just listing Kuminga with that knee tendonitis or knee soreness that's been on the injury report, but once someone asked him about it, he realized this was an actual healthy scratch, which is absolutely devastating for a young player who signed a contract extension just months ago thinking he'd be a core piece of this team's future. And SVP makes this really pointed observation, telling people who criticized him weeks ago when he said he didn't buy the knee soreness excuse, that it's okay to admit, when you were wrong, Kuminga has clearly been acting like a brat, and to quote the famous meme, "You're not that guy, pal. You're not that guy. He's simply not good enough to hold an organization hostage like this." Stephen A. Smith immediately jumps in, talking about how the blame pie needs to be distributed fairly when evaluating how this situation deteriorated so dramatically. And Stephen A. acknowledges that yes, the Warriors mishandled Kuminga's development initially, and the system fit was never ideal. But at the end of the day, that's what it is, and players have to adapt and evolve rather than sulking and creating locker room tension. And Stephen A. gets really animated, talking about how Kuminga's agent has mishandled things even worse than the Warriors did by not guiding him correctly and allowing him to develop this inflated sense of his own abilities and value, which has led to unrealistic expectations and frustration when those expectations weren't met by the coaching staff or front office. Tim Legler, who was also on the panel, then provides this absolutely fascinating technical breakdown of why Jonathan Kuminga will likely never develop into the elite ISO scorer that he and his camp believe he can become. And Legler reads this comment from a viewer that perfectly encapsulates the fundamental problem with Kuminga's game. And Legler reads, "To be an ISO scorer, there is a level of fluidity and touch you need, like Paul George, Kyrie Irving, James Harden, Luka Doncic, or you are much stronger than everyone else, to where it doesn't matter, like Zion Williamson or Julius Randle. But Kuminga isn't the bully that Randle or Zion is. Maybe he gets stronger with age, and he doesn't have the natural touch or fluidity to be an ISO scorer. So JK sits in that weird spot of not being a 6'9", 250-pound bully, and also not having the necessary fluidity to be an effective ISO player. And Legler emphasizes that the DeMar DeRozan or Kawhi Leonard comparisons can only be credible if Kuminga dramatically improves his touch and ball handling, which are both currently horrible, and, unfortunately, it's probably too late to develop touch at this stage of his career. Scott Van Pelt then gets really philosophical about the concept of touch in basketball, and whether it can actually be developed or if it's something innate that players either have or don't have. And SVP talks about how, when you watch 10 and 11-year-old kids play basketball, there are clearly some kids who have natural touch and some who don't, and he genuinely doesn't know if that's something you can develop later in life, or if your nervous system and hand coordination and fluidity of movement are essentially set at a young age. And Van Pelt makes this comparison to shooting in general, saying that players are becoming better shooters much later in their careers now because it's become an absolute necessity, so they're allowed a longer developmental runway. But touch is different from pure shooting mechanic. Touch is about feel and anticipation, and an innate understanding of how to use your body, which Kuminga simply doesn't possess. But here's where the SportsCenter discussion took this absolutely seismic turn that had everyone watching probably spitting out their drinks. And Stephen A. Smith introduces the possibility of the Golden State Warriors making an all-in push to acquire Giannis Antetokounmpo from the Milwaukee Bucks, who's reportedly unhappy and has asked the organization to evaluate potential trade. And Stephen A. gets absolutely fired up, explaining that if the Warriors are serious about maximizing what remains of Stephen Curry's championship window, which is closing rapidly given he's now 36 years old, then pursuing Giannis Antetokounmpo represents the exact type of aggressive win-now move they need to make, rather than continuing to invest in young players like Kuminga, who simply aren't developing fast enough to contribute at championship level. Tim Legler then provides this incredibly compelling tactical breakdown of why Giannis Antetokounmpo would be an absolutely perfect fit alongside Stephen Curry in Golden State's offensive system. And Legler talks about how the synergy between Giannis's dominance attacking the rim and finishing inside combined with the floor spacing generated by Curry's gravitational pull as the greatest shooter in NBA history would create essentially unstoppable offensive action. And Legler explains that defenses would face impossible decisions on every possession, because if you commit help defenders to stop Giannis driving to the basket, that leaves Curry wide open for threes, but if you stay home on Curry to prevent him from getting clean looks, then Giannis has a clear runway to the basket, where he's one of the most efficient finishers in NBA history. So either way, you're conceding high-percentage scoring opportunities that would be nearly impossible to defend consistently over a 7-game playoff series. Scott Van Pelt then addresses what he thinks are the primary motivations that could drive Giannis Antetokounmpo to actually want to join the Warriors if Milwaukee makes him available. And SVP starts with the most obvious, which is the pursuit of additional championships and the opportunity to join an established dynasty with proven championship infrastructure. And Van Pelt talks about how with the Warriors' veteran core of Curry and Draymond Green aging and their championship window rapidly closing, adding Giannis would represent an all-in push for their 5th title together, while from Giannis's perspective, it would give him the chance to win multiple additional rings with a franchise that knows how to develop championship-caliber rosters and coaching systems. And SVP emphasizes that recent reports from December 2025 indicate Giannis has asked the Bucks to evaluate trades, which suggests genuine dissatisfaction with Milwaukee's direction after they've lost key players and posted disappointing results, and the Bucks lack future assets to meaningfully improve the roster around him, which means his championship window in Milwaukee is essentially closed. Stephen A. Smith then gets really animated talking about the relationship dynamics that could facilitate this type of blockbuster move, and Stephen A. reveals that Giannis Antetokounmpo and Stephen Curry actually have a positive relationship, and they share the same agent Alex Saratzis, which could significantly smooth the behind-the-scenes discussions and negotiations if both parties are genuinely interested in making this happen. And Stephen A. makes this argument that when superstars share representation, it creates natural channels for communication and exploration of potential partnerships that might not exist otherwise, and having that trusted intermediary who understands both players' priorities and motivations can be the difference between a deal that comes together versus one that never gets past the exploratory phase. Tim Legler then shifts the discussion back to the Warriors' current roster situation and specifically talks about Quinton Post's emergence as a genuinely elite defensive player. And Legler explains that Post has shown incredible improvement in what he calls distance management, which is a term borrowed from fighting that refers to understanding range and striking distance. And Legler makes this fascinating observation that, similar to touch, he's not sure how much you can actually improve at distance management if you're naturally bad at it. Like James Wiseman, you're probably never going to get good because it's about feel and spatial awareness and nervous system coordination. But if you're decent at it, you can potentially become elite, which is exactly what Post has done. And Legler cites comments from Ron Adams, the longtime Warriors assistant who's still around the team, saying that Post simply doesn't want to get scored on. There's a competitiveness and fire to him that naturally lends itself to getting defensive stops and taking pride in that end of the floor. Scott Van Pelt then brings up this interesting observation about the competitive dynamic between Quinton Post and Gary Payton II, where they've been barking at each other during games on this road trip. And SVP emphasizes he doesn't think it's a real problem, but rather two competitive players who both take defense seriously, having animated discussions about mistakes and rotations. And Van Pelt makes this funny observation that GP2 obviously thinks of himself as one of the OGs on the team rightfully, so given his championship pedigree, but he probably doesn't love having this second-round rookie telling him he made a mistake, so they bark back and forth at each other and then keep it moving, which is actually a sign of healthy competitive culture rather than dysfunction. But then, Stephen A. Smith wants to give some recognition to Brandon Podziemski, who came off the bench in the Chicago game and dropped 27 points and 8 rebounds while shooting the 3-ball really decisively for the second consecutive game. And Stephen A. talks about how the pressure is definitely on for Podziemski, with Pat Spencer clearly cracking the rotation, DeAnthony Melton back from injury, and Seth Curry now part of the team. And Stephen A. makes this interesting psychological observation about how sometimes that fake-it-till-you-make-it mentality can get you far in life, but sometimes it can backfire where you fool yourself into thinking you've already made it when you actually haven't. And Podziemski had been carrying himself and speaking like he was a certified starter, and one of the core guys partially because Steve Kerr was treating him that way. But now, being pushed into more of a chip-on-the-shoulder underdog role where he has to fight for minutes, the early response has been really impressive, and he's playing with more urgency and decisiveness. Tim Legler then talks about what he thinks was the most important development from the Chicago game, which was Jimmy Butler not only playing but moving really well and looking healthy. And Legler explains there were legitimate concerns after Butler took that fall on his hip and got clipped on the knee against Oklahoma City about whether he'd be a decoy or limited in his mobility. But Legler describes watching Butler shoot passing lanes, run the floor aggressively, attack downhill with confidence, and eventually deliver the knockout punch in the fourth quarter when the Bulls had cut the lead to 8 or 10 points. Butler took over with timely ISO scoring, including a couple of dart threes that essentially ended any comeback hopes. And Legler emphasizes that having a healthy Jimmy Butler completely changes Golden State's playoff ceiling because he provides that secondary shot creation and late-game scoring punch that takes pressure off Curry in crucial moments. But here's where the panel brings everything full circle back to the Giannis Antetokounmpo possibility. And Scott Van Pelt makes this argument that if the Warriors are genuinely serious about contending for another championship before the Curry Green era ends, they need to be aggressive in pursuing elite talent, rather than continuing to develop young players who aren't progressing fast enough. And SVP talks about how the Jonathan Kuminga experiment has clearly failed. Despite the contract extension they gave him, Moses Moody hasn't developed into a consistent rotation player. So at some point, you have to cut your losses and pivot toward proven stars who can contribute immediately at championship level. And Van Pelt emphasizes that Giannis Antetokounmpo represents exactly that type of transformational talent who could pair with Curry to create an unstoppable offensive duo, while also providing the interior defense and rebounding that Golden State has lacked for years. What really struck me watching this entire SportsCenter segment was how the panel seamlessly wove together the immediate roster drama of Kuminga's benching and post's emergence with the broader strategic implications of potentially pursuing Giannis Antetokounmpo in a blockbuster trade. And I think the clear consensus was that Golden State is at a critical crossroads where they need to make a definitive decision about whether they're still trying to develop young talent for the future or if they're going all in on winning now with their aging core. And everything about their recent actions, from benching Kuminga to playing veterans heavy minutes to reportedly exploring trades, suggests they've chosen the win-now path. So if Milwaukee makes Giannis Antetokounmpo available, the Warriors absolutely need to be aggressive in pursuing him, because the partnership with Stephen Curry would create one of the most devastating offensive combinations in NBA history and give them legitimate championship odds for the next 2 or 3 years before this window closes permanently.